I'm Shadi Saad, Executive Director of Justice for Iran. I'll be moderating this event today. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes. Please make sure your phones are on silent. Also, the event is being recorded by my colleagues in the front row. Just a quick reminder that under the Human Rights Council's regulations, only they and the member of the media can take photos and videos of the event. Justice has been a central demand of Iranians since the constitutional revolution of '97, and yet it remains unfulfilled. Over the past 46 years, since the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, various groups have suffered atrocity crimes and grave human rights violations, while the perpetrators have enjoyed absolute impunity. The Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Iran, FFMI, has confirmed that the violent repression of peaceful protests constitute crimes against humanity, particularly targeting women and girls, LGBTQ persons, and religious and ethnic minorities. Today's event highlights the FFMI's second report presented to the Council yesterday and explored crucial next steps, including reparation measures to ensure justice for victims. Our discussion will highlight the need for the international community to activate existing accountability mechanisms, such as universal jurisdiction, corporate human rights responsibility, and rarely used regional measures, while exploring the role of people-driven justice initiatives like Iran Atrocities or on Tribunal in advancing accountability efforts, and how these mechanisms can complement one another. We'll start with a video message recorded for this event by the FFMI experts, because unfortunately they had to leave Geneva today morning and couldn't join us in person.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Hussain, here on behalf of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Iran. Thank you so much to Justice for Iran for inviting us to speak with you today. By the time you hear this message, we'll already have submitted our second report to the Human Rights Council, completing 2 years of investigations into the alleged human rights violations that occurred during the protests that broke out in Iran from the 16th of September 2022. During these 2 years, we have been fortunate in having cooperation from many civil society actors and an extraordinary number of victims and witnesses from inside and outside of Iran. We've collected 38,000 pieces of evidence. We've spoken to 285 victims and witnesses, and we've examined incidents across 17 different provinces. We've preserved all of this evidence, and we'll make it available for credible legal proceedings whenever and wherever they may happen. Our report set out not only our mandated report to the Human Rights Council, but also the conference room paper, the longer extended version, which I hope you'll all see. They set out our consolidated findings from these 2 years. These reaffirm that the 2022 protests were repressed by the Iranian state and that gross human rights violations were committed, some of which amount to crimes against humanity. We made findings and found evidence in relation to the unlawful use of force, arbitrary arrest and detention, torture and ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, including rape, and serious fair trial violations. In this past year, as previously, we did receive information from the government of Iran. This year, we were told that a number of prosecutions had been initiated against law enforcement agencies, that compensation had been paid to victims, and that other actions were also being taken, including setting up potential new institutions to address the issue of the violations. However, we have not received enough documentation or information to be able to assess this adequately at this point, and we certainly have not found that the issues of impunity have been adequately addressed at all. In terms of our findings this year, we found new evidence with respect to violations affecting children, both boys and girls, and also ethnic and religious minorities and LGBTQI persons. With respect to children, we found violations in relation to torture, arbitrary arrest and detention, and also in relation to the treatment of children, We gathered evidence of unnecessary and unlawful use of force and heard many accounts of psychological and physical torture. In relation to ethnic and religious minorities, again, we found that they were especially targeted in the course of the protests. We found particular forms of torture against ethnic and religious minorities, and we also made new findings with respect to the incident of Bloody Friday, that one day on which 103 people lost their lives, were killed, following unlawful and unnecessary use of force. We also made findings regarding LGBTQ+ persons amongst the protesters being targeted for their real or perceived sexual orientation or identity. This year we made some new findings with respect to alleged suicides of young protesters, particularly girls. We found that in these cases there was a pattern in relation to the state's response of denying these incidents, failing to investigate adequately, and also harassing the family members of those who had died. We also found new evidence in relation to the use of new forms of psychological torture, in particular mock executions against detainees, women, men, and children. And finally, we found examples of transnational repression, of attempted assassinations and kidnappings of individual Iranians abroad, of victims of their family members, and also of human rights defenders. So we found that Iran did use its tools of repression not only inside the country, but abroad.
I'm Shaheen Sardar Ali, member of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on Iran, and thank you very much to Justice for Iran for inviting us. I'm going to speak about our investigations into continuing violations against victims and survivors and their families in the aftermath of the protests. I will also speak about major shifts in policies and practices impacting women and girls as well as protesters during the past year. We found an alarming pattern of systematic repression and silencing of victims and their families, including through summons, detentions, and prosecutions, and preventing them from commemorating the deaths of their loved ones, with violence escalating during the anniversary of the protests, both in 2023 and 2024. Persecutory conduct extends to those who have acted in solidarity, such as human rights defenders, lawyers, teachers, trade unionists, and journalists, compelling many to leave Iran. 10 men have been executed so far, and another 11 men and 3 women are at imminent risk of execution. There has been an alarming increase in the use of the death penalty, a 3-fold increase from 2021, the year before the protests. Executions were carried out amidst credible reports of gross fair trial violations, including torture-tainted confessions. A new and worrying trend is death sentences against women, including for their activism. And we have the cases of Bakhshan Azizi and Sharifeh Mohammadi, who are at imminent risk of execution, as well as Varishe Moradi, whose request for review is pending before Iran's Supreme Court. Digital space was a critical arena for protesters. Equally, surveillance online was a critical tool for state repression. Instagram accounts, for example, were shut down and SIM cards confiscated, in particular of human rights defenders, including women human rights defenders. Together, these actions demonstrate the concerted, persistent state efforts to stifle dissent, perpetuating a climate of fear and systematic impunity that denies victims the rights to truth, justice, accountability, and reparations. Regarding structural discrimination against women and girls, despite the pre-election promises by the President to ease restriction enforcement, the state has ramped up the enforcement of mandatory hijab laws and policies. While a new law is pending consideration, its provisions have already started to be applied, with increased deployment of police and of the so-called ambassadors of kindness deployed by the IRGC to enforce the mandatory hijab in public places. At least 2 women and 1 man have been subjected to flogging for violating those laws or advocating for their repeal in the last year. We have also seen the chilling enhancing of surveillance through apps, drones, and use of facial recognition technology, with thousands of women having their cars impounded and many more being made to pay exorbitant fines.
Good afternoon. My name is Viviana Kristisevich. I'm also a member of the fact-finding mission on Iran. And it is truly a pleasure and an honor to join you at this important event to talk about the findings of our report and accountability. I will explain some of the work that we did on reparations and accountability. We have built a stronger roadmap for reparations and accountability, both in our mandated report and in our conference room paper. I hope you read it. It is very important to have a strong report on reparations, because it's necessary to ensure that victims have their rights respected, but also that societies have the necessary guarantees that the violations and crimes against humanity that we documented do not happen again. We took steps to build this roadmap that were unique. We consulted with many victims to understand what were their expectations. And we also went to great lengths to consult with experts and colleagues to understand the diverse experiences that we could bring to bear to add to the different options that government officials and the international community, victims and academics could have in order to address the ways in which the government and the international community would secure the rights to truth, justice, equality, and reparations for victims of crimes against humanity and human rights violations in Iran. In doing so, we were very mindful that structural discrimination against women in law and in practice was at the very base of the human rights violations and the crimes against humanity that we documented. We had said in our reports that that type of discrimination was the enabler and the trigger for harm done to victims. And so when looking at the reparations that were necessary to stop the cycles of violence and discrimination, we tried to make specific recommendations about the legal reforms and the practices that needed to change in order to enhance the possibilities of a life that is full and free for all women in Iran. And we made specific recommendations on changes to the laws. We asked for a repeal of mandatory hijab laws, as well as the lifting of all restrictions that limited the possibility of women of freely participating in public life, including accessing positions in the judiciary in an equal footing to men. But we went beyond that. We asked the government of Iran to free those that are still in prison or being prosecuted with laws that are blatantly against the human rights principles and standards that they have to abide by. We asked for the stop of the death penalty. And as my colleague Shaheen has said, there are some that are at an imminent risk. We also recommended measures that the international community can take in order to support victims, including medical and psychological support, visas for victims of persecution and gross human rights violations, memorialization, and truth-telling initiatives supported by different actors that would allow to create a different narrative around the violations suffered by victims, and the establishment of a fund for victims. Now, on the right to justice and on accountability, we took that task very seriously because justice is one of the claims that came more clearly from victims and survivors. And it's a right protected under international human rights law. We looked at what could be done domestically, and we established that there was chronic impunity and that most of the victims, most of the time, couldn't have their right to truth, justice, or compensation protected in Iran. So we made suggestions for the development of legal proceedings in other countries at the international level and also in third countries based on principles of universal jurisdiction, for example. We also documented very thoroughly the responsibilities under human rights law and under international criminal law of individuals and entities that were involved in crimes against international law and gross human rights violations. We have also concluded that based on the findings that we had and the continuing nature of some of the persecutory acts that still remain and are deployed by the government of Iran against women and girls and against those that have expressed solidarity with the women life freedom movement, it is critical that the Human Rights Council consider to establish a follow-up body to follow up on our mandate. We have a mandate that is restricted to facts that occurred after 2022. It's restricted thematically in a significant manner to human rights violations and crimes against humanity that are linked to the protests. Now, we believe, for what we've seen, that there's a need to go deeper and to go longer. Thank you so much.
Our first speaker today is Professor Carla Firstman. She's the director of Human Rights Center at the University of Essex and a former executive director of Redress. With extensive experience in human rights, she has also served as an expert to the Council of Europe and worked on refugee property claims in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Professor Firstman, Redress and FIDH published a handbook, a kind of guideline for NGOs on how to use universal jurisdiction as a tool for accountability. With your research and experience on universal jurisdiction, how feasible do you see this tool for Iranian victims? And also, in particular, I'm referring to the FFM reports, the parts that they suggested that the cases of foreign and dual nationals taken hostage in Iran would be more appealing to the European prosecutors to take investigations on those cases.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be here. Universal jurisdiction is absolutely critical because we're facing such a situation of impunity. Looking at the mandate of universal jurisdiction and the crimes as pursued by the FFM, it's clear that torture, as well as crimes against humanity, were crucial to their findings. Under the Convention Against Torture, universal jurisdiction, the prosecute or extradite function is absolutely clear. Most states around the world that have ratified the Convention Against Torture have included in their domestic legislation a provision related to extradite or prosecute. So this is absolutely feasible from that perspective. With crimes against humanity, many states, perhaps less than torture, but many states also have a universal jurisdiction provision. It's also clear that with respect to hostage-taking, the hostage-taking convention additionally has an extradite or prosecute function. With respect to universal jurisdiction, the way domestic law works will differ state to state. Some frameworks are stronger than others, but suffice to say that it's an important possibility, but it will only lead to the prosecution of a small number of offenders who happen to travel, who happen to be accessible to the jurisdiction in question. One of the challenges, though, which I think is important to mention, which the fact-finding mission has referred to, is the challenges with respect to hostage-taking resulting from the exercise of universal jurisdiction. So what do I mean here? I mean the case, for instance, of Hamid Nouri, who was prosecuted in Sweden, which led to Iran seeking to have a prisoner swap with a Swedish individual who was detained arbitrarily in Iran. The same situation occurred with respect to Asadullah Azadi with respect to Belgium. So this shouldn't deter states from exercising universal jurisdiction, quite the opposite, but what it should require is that states think carefully about how to intensify their efforts to address this phenomenon of state hostage-taking, which is very prevalent in Iran at present. Thank you.
Our second speaker is Regina Paulos, joining us online from the United States. She's the co-chair of the American Bar Association International Section's International Criminal Law Committee. Beyond writing, teaching, and speaking at events like these, she has years of experience advocating for victims groups, including Rohingya people of Myanmar and the Iranians. As the legal advisor to Justice Beyond Borders, the co-sponsor of this event, she has recently been experiencing ways to expand accountability efforts for Iran. And she's now joining us to tell us a little bit about the lesser mechanisms that could be used for victims of atrocity crimes in Iran. Regina, the floor is yours. Like you need to off. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah, could you use your earphone to? But then you need also to do it because of the video. If there is any way to. It's fine. Okay. Go ahead, Regina.
Iran, the international rights discussed in these forums do not even translate as a practice into practice or even into the laws, even though Iran has signed various treaties indicating a commitment to international laws and principles. The new fact-finding mission report highlights that people within Iran cannot get access to justice and participate in fair and transparent proceedings. The report specifically calls attention to the special committee set up to investigate the 2022 unrest, and yet the FFMI's report indicates that victims hardly knew about the committee or how to even access it. In addition, the report, of course, echoes what every single special rapporteur in Iran has discussed in all their reports, which is a chronic lack of prosecutions or investigations against government and law enforcement personnel or serious violations of human rights. Here we are in 2025, and yet another report has come out about the chronic impunity that plagues Iran and the complete absence of the rule of law. So against this backdrop, and to answer Shadi's question, civil society should start to consider other forums to create change and possibly obtain justice. And one example is the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which has national contact points where complaints can be filed. Civil society should be more proactive about investigating which multinational corporations are doing business with Iran and in turn are facilitating the types of tools needed for Iran to continue repression. Justice for Iran and Justice Beyond Borders recently finished a matter with the Korean National Contact Point regarding dual-use equipment. The ability to have a conversation with companies regarding the impact of their business dealings with governments who are not serious about human rights can be extremely effective in creating change. Further, the international community must do more to engage or focus on those countries who are buying arms and other types of weapons from Iran, because that income goes a long way into further entrenching the power structures that are constantly abusing civilians in Iran. We need to start rethinking the relationship between security and human rights, and these two issues go hand in hand. And even today, we see this morning Iran calling the UK and other members of the Security Councils into meetings regarding the nuclear deal, even though just yesterday a huge report comes out from the Human Rights Council regarding crimes against humanity continuing in Iran. Other mechanisms that should be considered are the National Human Rights Commissions in various countries. Many people from Iran live in different countries, and they may not realize that oftentimes these independent institutions can be engaged and likely could lead to policy changes. While it starts at a local level, in turn, it could impact national level policies or perhaps even regional policies. Of course, the Americas, Europe, and Africa have specialized regional human rights commissions, which should also be considered as potential avenues for action. And finally, I want to also emphasize the importance of creating independent scholarship and workshops to bring together victims and survivors alongside academics to continue to document and discuss ongoing rights violations. The creation of these kinds of forums can be incredibly important in countering narratives which are based on false information or fake news. In the United States, there's an uptick in universities creating virtual records archives. For example, the University of Southern California hosts a visual archive dedicated to the genocide which took place in Guatemala. I would encourage civil society to continue to pursue all options and find ways to share their truths. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Regina. Thank you so much, Regina. We'll be back to you with more questions in the second one. Our last speaker is Colleen Johan. She'll focus on People's Tribunal and the initiatives related to them. Colleen has worked as a defense lawyer at the International Criminal Tribunal on former Yugoslavia, the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia, and other international courts. She was also a judge at the International People's Tribunal on the atrocities that took place during the November 2019 protest in Iran, or as it's more known, Afghan Tribunal. Colleen, for those who might know about People's Tribunals as civil society initiatives, could you just tell us a little bit about what People's Tribunals are and And based on your experience on both formal criminal proceedings and people's tribunal, do you think that these people-led initiatives can provide victims with a degree of justice?
I have to say that it's very difficult to say a few words about people's tribunals because it's a very large topic. And I was, after years of being a criminal defense lawyer, both domestically and then almost 20 years in the international courts, very impressed with the Aban Tribunal, how it was put together, the investigation that was done to create it, and the manner in which it was run. And this is now a topic that is very close to my heart. And it definitely involves an institution, potential institution, that's another forum for seeking some end to the impunity for the kinds of horrors and crimes and what we see unfolding every day in the news around the world. And we all know that the International Criminal Court, as well as the ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and Rwanda, one of their guiding principles, or maybe a major guiding principle, was to put an end to impunity. But obviously that hasn't happened. And there are other things that need to be done in order to pursue that goal. And I believe that people's tribunals are an institution that begins to address it in a real way. The first one, and some of you may know about this, the very first People's Tribunal occurred in 1966 and 67. Bertrand Russell came up in his brilliant mind with this brilliant idea. And as Shadi has pointed out, this is an institution that is based upon the citizens' initiative to put together a place where there can be an investigation of the facts and then a hearing, public hearings, and a creation of some kind of report or judgment that deals with events that are going unaddressed by other legal organizations, governmental, international, domestic, whatever. And I'm going to obviously focus, I guess, a bit on the Aban Tribunal because that's my direct experience. But I think it's a good example because it was a very successful tribunal. The idea is that the people who are involved, be it the NGOs or other individuals, will go and find witnesses, find information, find evidence, put it together, and then bring it before people who have agreed to act as in a judicial capacity and have public hearings, as mentioned. And so the issues that are raised by that evidence can be explored in a reasonable way. So one of the things we did in the Aban Tribunal, which I think was very effective, although there's more than one way to do a tribunal, is that we created a statute for the tribunal saying why it's there, the principles that it was based upon, and we relied heavily, of course, on international criminal law, international human rights law. We created rules about the procedures and evidence. What evidence could come in? How would it be tested? And we tried very hard to bear in mind the standards that have been set in the international courts, as well as domestic courts, of course, but to assure that the evidence that came in was reliable and that it was tested by examination so that the findings that were made would be considered to be trustworthy by people who are looking to these tribunals to create some record of what went on. And that worked well there. I think also a very important aspect of Aban Tribunal was that it was publicly broadcast so that individuals in Iran, for example, could see that something was being done, someone was coming forth to put together information to address what had been going on there. And in fact, we had a very, I think unique, I'm not sure, experience there, which is when we began the tribunal, we had something like 50 or 55 witnesses, witness statements primarily. Only a handful of witnesses were able to appear in person. But after the first couple days of the tribunal had been broadcast, we ended up with an additional 170 witness statements, I believe, of people who came forward because they saw something was happening. And despite concerns about their own safety and the safety of their families, or maybe because of the concerns of the safety for family, they came forward, and a huge amount of evidence was produced as a result of this, all of which is available to the world now in the recordings of the tribunal and also in the website that the tribunal has put together and is there and is maintained. There are a number of roles that a tribunal like this can function, and I've made a list of them. This is just my list. There's certainly open to people to create what, or to put together what they think a kind of tribunal can do, but in my opinion, these are some of the most important ones. First of all, it evaluates evidence. It listens to victims and the families of victims. So these individuals can come forward and say, look, this is what happened to me. This is not a news article, and you're going to get more information than a 2-second running, thing on the front of your television. We're going to tell you what happened, and we're going to tell you in detail. And I think this is one of the most important things, and it was certainly something that was addressed by the witnesses in Aban. Based upon that will of course increase public awareness of what went on. That's important, and it's another major role for the tribunals. The tribunals can decide whether violations occurred, violations of human rights, violations of criminal law. If so, what were they? Who was involved in them? And in the Aban tribunal, we came to conclusions about the crimes that were revealed by the evidence that we saw, and we made findings beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a standard that's used always in criminal law, that those crimes had in fact occurred. We then made findings based on the same evidence as to who we believed was responsible for those crimes, and there was a whole list of people. Those findings were not made beyond a reasonable doubt for the simple reason that fairness and also trustworthiness in these proceedings required that the individuals who were accused of this would have some opportunity to respond to it. Now, Iran was invited more than once to participate in the Aban tribunal. They refused. They sent no one there. They made no comment about it at the time it was occurring. But nonetheless, in accordance with proper principles of fairness and due process, there was no finding made beyond a reasonable doubt as to these individuals. However, we did find that there was reasonable, strong cause for them to be investigated and brought forward for a trial, which is an important aspect of this. Another thing that occurred to me actually after Aban was concluded was that the fact that the victims could come forward and tell their story was, of course, a very important aspect of this. But there was another side to that, which was that a lot of these people or their family members had been accused of being criminals themselves. And that was an unfair accusation, and they weren't. And so their ability to come forward and give their side of the story, finally, also recognize that they were not the criminals that, I'm running out of time because I always do, I always say too much. But they are not the criminals that their states had suggested that they were. And it also creates, very, very importantly, a historical record. People go away, people die, people forget. If a tribunal is held, their testimony is then memorialized. It's there for others to look at. And so I've sort of lost the beginning of your question about victims. I will address it briefly. I'm not sure if a People's Tribunal can address the concerns of victims better than an international court. But having said that, I'm not sure how well international courts address the concerns of victims. There's the ability to get reparations, which is a very difficult, cumbersome, and poorly put together aspect of the ICC, the International Criminal Court. There are provisions that can be provided to victims in these international courts, like witness protection and other things that are valuable for them, although the Aban Tribunal was able to provide some protection for people. And so, to me, it's all an ongoing process. The People's Tribunals are another example of what we can do as a community to address these situations, bring them to the attention of governments, put on moral pressure on governments and international institutions to go after the individuals and explore these things. And as Bertrand Russell actually said, silence itself under these conditions is also a crime.
Thank you, Colin. It was so fascinating for me. It was so fascinating for me to see that the FFM's reports, in the FFM's reports, there was a reference to people's tribunals as a complementary measures for truth telling and truth seeking for the victims. And I think I do agree with them that, and also with what you said, that the formal mechanisms, whether they are UN bodies or international courts, cannot do everything to the victims, even in the International Tribunal on Yugoslavia, we've seen that, and before as well. In a few weeks, the Human Rights Council will decide on a resolution that extend the mandate of the fact-finding mission for, I think, until 2026. One of the recommendations that was made by the FFM as a reparatory mechanism was to establishment a victims fund. And I guess if the FFM's mandate is extended, they will also pursue the enforcement and implementation of that fund. So as someone who have worked on redress and reparation for so long, what do you think about the recommendation?
The first place to start is with acknowledging that the harm suffered by victims was absolutely tremendous. So the FFM has recognized that, setting up a victims fund as a natural reaction to the extensive, varied, intensive losses and harm suffered by victims and their communities. So it's an excellent recognition of that, to set up a fund to address these harms. There are some challenges though. The first challenge is that clearly the bulk of the victims that the FFM has documented are in Iran, and the ability for a fund to be set up, supported by external funds, in the context where there are still sanctions in place, is challenging. It doesn't make it impossible, but it's certainly challenging to set up an effective fund which is going to reach some of the most vulnerable people inside Iran. Additionally, even if one can imagine that the sanctions are not a prohibitive bar to arriving at the victims, we know from the FFM, we also know from our experience on the Aban Tribunal, that to engage with some of these truth-seeking processes will incur the wrath of the regime. So if one imagines that the most vulnerable victims in Iran are receiving financial or other kind of benefit from outside, that this may put them at a variety of kinds of risks. So one would need to take that into account. Certainly some funds can be directed at the many victims who have left Iran, but in the context of the events, that would be inadequate, given that the harm suffered and the most significant needs are within the country. So I think this is something which certainly needs to be addressed. One needs to consider carefully. One needs to ensure that any international funds set up to support victims works closely with civil society groups, both inside Iran as well as outside of Iran, and takes an approach which doesn't limit itself to victims who happen to be outside of the country.
Thank you so much. So just very briefly, because Carla mentioned about her experience in your own tribunal. So if the mandate of the FFM is extended, so it's going to be to have a broader scope than it has now. What do you think about incorporating the outcomes of Alban Tribunal and Iran Tribunal to the FFM's work?
I actually think that that's the reason people's tribunals exist, in a sense. As I mentioned earlier, there's a record created of the testimony of victims and other witnesses. There's documents that are submitted. A huge amount of evidence is produced. And that isn't meant to sit in a room somewhere and no one sees it anymore. The whole idea, as far as I'm concerned, is that that information will then be given to other institutions, certainly in the hopes of creating a prosecution or investigation that has the legal authority to hold people accountable, but certainly in the context that you raised, that Alban Tribunal, for example, there were detailed findings made, granted earlier than 2022, of course, about what was going on in Iran in 2019 that would have to do with the structure of the government, the structure of the police and other security forces that were there, the people who were in charge of those forces, the manner in which they responded to people who were in the street and demonstrating at the time, and the findings of international law, findings of domestic law. All of this can be made available to other entities who are looking essentially at the same situation. And although granted, the evidence in Alban came from a couple of years earlier, nothing's changed. The government structure is the same. And I watched, in horror, as we all did, what went on when the women were attacked in the streets and the demonstrations that occurred in 2022. And I'm looking at it thinking, this is exactly what happened with Alban. You could almost predict what would be happening. So those methods of operating, the patterns of behavior, all of that is there already, and certainly I think not only can, but should be incorporated into any further proceedings that come up.
So, Regina, could you just briefly share with us if you have any thoughts about how this the mandate's extension would impact or strengthen the existing accountability mechanisms for Iran, both within and outside the UN human rights mechanisms?
Thanks, Shadi. I think the extension of the mandate is an important one, and I think, and I've said this before, and actually I said it on the last day after the Alban Tribunal report was released, that really I think the need for any mechanism that exists for Iran has to incorporate and definitely include the ability to obtain evidence, store evidence, and then be able to engage with mechanisms from all over the world when lawsuits or when any type of actions are initiated. And so, most of the time we think of the independent investigative mechanisms like the one for Myanmar, which is, in my opinion, very effective. But I think that if the states are willing to back the extension of this mandate of the FFM, as long as it can incorporate this mechanism, it would be good. And one of the examples that I would argue that maybe this kind of expanded, mandate of the FFM would be, for example, looking at this case that was just filed in Florida regarding the man who was part of during the time of the Shah's regime, Sabeti, who is now being sued. And in a case like that, a mechanism like the FFM, or whether it's an independent investigative mechanism, the victims who are aging, we're losing them, we're losing evidence. This could all be documented and kept so that they could engage in these processes, which I think are very important. So I think in the long run, any mechanism that the UN adopts after today's date has to be able to be flexible enough to interact with any type of proceedings, including the ones that I mentioned, which are involving in the OECD, if that's one option, the Human Rights Commissions, as I mentioned, and any other type of lawsuits that take place.
Thank you so much, Regina. I'd like to open the floor now. If there is any question from any of the speakers, please say your name and your affiliations. Any questions?
Well, I come.
You just use your mic.
Okay. Well, I come from Sweden, a trade union confederation. You talked about Hamid Nouri. You know, Hamid Nouri, he was being executed, be in the jail, life in jail. But the government, they give him asylum because when he left Sweden, then if he comes to Iran, then he's not going to be charged again. What happened to those people who have been witness about how horrible things happen to them? And what will be in the future if this happen in democratic courts in Europe? But you know, the government and the politics, they change it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think you raise a really important point. I think in terms of persons who can't be returned to their countries because of a well-founded fear of persecution, this is a well-tread story. I think what's important is that countries like Sweden continue to investigate these crimes, that these crimes continue to be prosecuted wherever the individuals are found. This is the heart of accountability and an international system of accountability. So this has to be the starting point.
Thank you. Any other questions? So I guess I should only say thank you all for attending. I really hope to see you in our future events, and also I hope that all our collective efforts for justice and accountability in Iran to deal with the issue of chronic impunity will be successful sooner than later. Thank you.